Picture this: you're standing at the edge of consciousness, that liminal space between wakefulness and sleep, where your mind begins to dissolve the rigid boundaries of logic. Tonight, you're not just going to rest, you're about to embark on a journey through the most unsettling corners of human thought, where reason itself becomes the enemy. You close your eyes, but your mind refuses to quiet. Instead, it whispers, "What if everything you believe about reality is just an elaborate trick your brain plays on itself? What if the very act of thinking is a paradox so profound that once you truly understand it, you can never think the same way again?" Welcome to the theatre of broken logic, where philosophers have spent centuries constructing puzzles that don't just challenge your intellect, they threaten to unravel the very fabric of rational thought. These aren't just mental games. They're cognitive time bombs designed to explode the comfortable assumptions you've built your entire worldview upon. Consider the Ship of Theseus, floating in the harbour of your imagination. This ancient vessel has been maintained for centuries, each rotting plank replaced with new wood, each rusted nail swapped for fresh metal. Year after year, piece by piece, until not a single original component remains. The question that has haunted thinkers for millennia emerges from the shadows. Is this still the same ship? Your mind might rush to answer, but hold on. The paradox deepens. What if someone collected all those discarded original pieces and rebuilt them into a ship? Now you have two vessels, one made entirely of new materials but maintaining continuous existence, another constructed from all the original parts but with a gap in its timeline. Which one is the real Ship of Theseus? This isn't just about boats, this is about you. Every cell in your body replaces itself over time. The neurons firing in your brain right now weren't there 7 years ago. Your thoughts, your memories, your personality, they're all housed in completely different physical matter than when you were born. So, who are you really? Are you the same person who went to sleep last night? Or are you an imposter wearing the memories of someone who no longer exists? The paradox spreads like a virus through your consciousness. If identity is an illusion, then what about continuity? What about the stories you tell yourself about who you are and where you're going? What if the very concept of self is just another ship sailing through an ocean of change, constantly rebuilding itself while pretending to remain the same? But we're just getting started. The ancient Greeks knew something we've forgotten in our rush toward technological certainty. Some questions are designed not to be answered, but to break the questioner. They understood that true wisdom often begins with the comfortable destruction of false knowledge. Zeno's paradoxes await in the darkness of your contemplation. Imagine Achilles, the swiftest of mortals, racing against a tortoise. The tortoise gets a head start. Logic tells us Achilles will easily win, but Zeno's mathematics suggest otherwise. To catch the tortoise, Achilles must first reach the point where the tortoise started, but by the time he gets there, the tortoise has moved forward. Achilles must then reach this new position, but again the tortoise has advanced. This continues infinitely, Achilles getting closer and closer, but never quite catching up. The paradox isn't really about racing, it's about motion itself, about the fundamental nature of space and time. If Zeno is right, then movement is impossible. Yet here you are, moving through this very moment, your heart beating, your blood flowing, your thoughts racing from one idea to the next. You are living proof that the paradox is wrong, yet you cannot explain why the logic fails. This is where philosophy becomes dangerous. It doesn't just question what you believe, it questions whether believing itself makes any sense. You think you understand cause and effect, but do you? You assume that for every action there's a reaction, that events follow logical sequences, that the future grows organically from the past. But what if causation is just another story we tell ourselves to make sense of chaos? The Buddhist concept of dependent origination suggests that nothing exists independently. Everything arises in dependence upon everything else in an infinite web of interconnection. But this creates a vertigo-inducing problem. If everything depends on everything else, then nothing has independent existence. You don't exist independently of your thoughts, but your thoughts don't exist independently of you. Your consciousness doesn't exist independently of your brain, but your brain's meaning doesn't exist independently of consciousness. We're caught in a loop where the observer and the observed, the thinker and the thought, the questioner and the question all collapse into a single, incomprehensible unity. This isn't just philosophical speculation, it's a direct threat to the basic structure of how you organize reality. As you lie there in the darkness, feeling your body settle into sleep, notice how these paradoxes aren't just abstract puzzles, they're alive in this very moment. The you that started reading this is not the same you that's reading now. The thoughts you're thinking are changing the thinker, the questions are questioning the questioner. And perhaps most disturbing of all, if these paradoxes are true, then the very act of trying to solve them changes their nature. You cannot step outside the system to examine it objectively because you are the system. You cannot think about thinking without thinking, cannot observe consciousness without consciousness, cannot escape the prison of perspective. So as your mind begins to drift towards sleep, carry this with you. Maybe the goal isn't to solve these paradoxes. Maybe the goal is to let them solve you, to dissolve you, to carry you into that space where logic breaks down and something else, something impossible to name, begins. The theatre of broken logic is always open, and the show is about to begin. You're lying in bed right now, and you believe you chose to be here. You decided to listen to this exploration of paradoxes. You selected this moment to rest. You determined the position of your body and the direction of your thoughts. But what if every choice you think you're making has already been made for you by forces beyond your awareness or control? The illusion of free will might be the most devastating paradox of all because it strikes at the heart of human dignity. If you don't actually choose your choices, then what are you? A biological machine executing predetermined programs, a sophisticated puppet dancing to strings you cannot see? Consider this moment carefully. You think you're deciding whether to continue listening or to drift off to sleep. But neuroscientists have discovered something unsettling. They can predict your decisions up to 10 seconds before you become consciously aware of making them. Your brain activity patterns reveal your choice before you know what you've chosen. This suggests that consciousness isn't the director of your mental theatre. It's more like a narrator telling stories about decisions that have already been made elsewhere. The determinist argument is elegantly brutal in its simplicity. Every event, including every thought in your head, is the inevitable result of prior causes stretching back to the beginning of time. The position of every atom in your brain right now was determined by the position of atoms moments ago, which were determined by their positions moments before that, in an unbroken chain of causation extending back to the Big Bang. From this perspective, your sense of choosing is just an evolutionary trick, a useful illusion that motivates behavior without actually controlling it. You feel like you're the author of your actions because feeling that way serves survival, not because it's true. The experience of deliberation, of weighing options and making decisions is just your brain's way of processing information, but the outcome was always inevitable. But wait, the paradox deepens when you try to escape it. If determinism is true, then your belief in determinism was also determined. You didn't choose to accept this idea through rational analysis. You were always going to accept it or reject it, based on factors beyond your control. This means that determinism cannot be rationally argued for or against because rationality itself would be an illusion. The compatibilists offer what seems like a compromise. Maybe free will and determinism can coexist. They argue that you can be free as long as your actions flow from your own desires and aren't externally coerced, even if those desires are themselves determined. But this feels like philosophical sleight of hand. If your desires are determined, then in what meaningful sense are you free when you follow them? Here's where the paradox becomes personally unsettling. Right now, as you process these ideas, you're experiencing the strange loop of a determined being contemplating its own determination. If you feel disturbed by the possibility that free will is an illusion, was that feeling of disturbance also determined? If you choose to reject these arguments, was that rejection freely chosen or simply the inevitable result of your neural programming? The quantum mechanics enthusiasts suggest that fundamental randomness in the universe might rescue free will, but randomness isn't freedom, it's just chaos. A decision based on quantum uncertainty isn't freely willed, it's arbitrary. Being unpredictable doesn't make you free, it just makes you random. Consider the paradox of moral responsibility. Every legal system, every ethical framework, every relationship you have is built on the assumption that people are responsible for their actions. But if free will is an illusion, then praise and blame become meaningless. The criminal didn't choose to commit the crime. The hero didn't choose to be heroic. They were all just dominoes falling in patterns determined by physics. Yet even knowing this, you still feel responsible for your actions. You still experience guilt, pride, regret, and satisfaction. You still make plans and set goals as if your choices matter. The feeling of agency is so fundamental to human experience that it persists, even when you intellectually reject it. This creates a bizarre double consciousness. You know you're not free, but you can't help acting as if you are. You understand that your sense of control is illusory, but you continue to try to control things. You recognize that your decisions are determined, but you keep making decisions as if they matter. Perhaps most disturbing of all, you cannot choose to stop believing in choice. Even if you accept that free will is an illusion, you cannot will yourself to stop experiencing the illusion. You're trapped in the experience of freedom while knowing it's a prison. The existentialists tried to rescue human dignity by arguing that even if your actions are determined, the meaning you assign to them is yours to choose. But if meaning-making is just another brain process, then your interpretations are as determined as everything else. You don't choose what things mean to you. Meaning emerges from neural processes you don't control. Some philosophers argue that the very fact that we can conceive of free will, even if it doesn't exist, points to something genuinely transcendent about consciousness. But this might just be another comforting story, another way that determined beings make sense of their determination. As you lie there contemplating these ideas, notice the strange recursive quality of the experience. You're using your mind to examine your mind, employing consciousness to investigate consciousness, exercising what feels like choice to question choice itself. This self-referential loop creates a kind of cognitive vertigo where the ground of certainty dissolves beneath your feet. And here's the final twist in this particular paradox. Whether or not free will exists, you're going to keep living as if it does. You'll wake up tomorrow and make decisions, form intentions, take responsibility for your actions, and hold others accountable for theirs. The illusion is so complete, so necessary for functioning, that even recognizing it as an illusion doesn't break its spell. So, as your consciousness begins to fade into sleep, carry this question with you. If you're not the author of your thoughts, then who is thinking right now? And if no one is really thinking, then what is this experience you're having? The prison of choice locks from the inside, and the key was thrown away before you were born. What if everything you've ever experienced, every sensation, every memory, every moment of consciousness is nothing more than electrical impulses in a computer simulation? What if your entire reality, including this very thought, is just code running on some unimaginably advanced machine? You might want to dismiss this as science fiction, but consider this. Right now, we create increasingly sophisticated virtual worlds. Video games generate entire universes populated by characters who, if they were conscious, would have no way to know they're simulated. We're already running primitive simulations of weather systems, economic models, and even simple forms of artificial life. Given the exponential growth of computing power, it's not unreasonable to imagine that someday we'll create simulations indistinguishable from reality. Here's where the logic becomes unavoidable. If advanced civilizations can create perfect simulations, they'll probably create many of them. Thousands, millions, perhaps billions of simulated worlds for research, entertainment, or purposes we can't even imagine. This means that for every real world, there would be countless simulated ones. The math is unsettling. If there's one base reality and a million simulations, the odds that you're in the real world are 1 in a million. You're statistically more likely to be a simulated being than a real one. Your entire existence, your loves, fears, dreams, and memories, would be nothing more than data processing in a computer you'll never see. But the paradox deepens when you try to find evidence. Any test you devise to determine whether you're in a simulation could itself be simulated. The very physical laws you'd use to investigate reality could be programmed parameters of the simulation. You could be a character in a video game so sophisticated that it includes the illusion of scientific inquiry. Think about the glitches you've noticed in life, the moments of déjà vu, the strange coincidences, the times when realities seem to stutter or repeat. What if these aren't psychological quirks but actual glitches in the code? What if the Mandela effect, where large groups of people remember historical events differently than recorded history suggests, is evidence of patches and updates to our simulated world? The quantum mechanics of our universe already behave suspiciously like a computer program. Particles don't have definite properties until observed, as if the simulation only renders details when someone's looking. The universe has a maximum speed limit and smallest possible measurements, just like the pixel resolution and frame rate of a video game. Reality seems pixelated at the quantum level. Could this be evidence of underlying computational architecture? Even more disturbing, if you're simulated, what does that make your consciousness? Are you actually experiencing anything? Or is the sense of experience itself just another layer of simulation? When you feel pain, joy, or fear, is something really feeling these things, or is there just the simulation of feeling without any actual experiencer? This leads to the problem of other minds in a simulated world. If you're conscious, assuming you are the other people in your life also conscious, or are they just non-player characters? Sophisticated programs designed to interact with you believably. Your parents, friends, loved ones, they might be nothing more than algorithms generating appropriate responses to your actions. The isolation becomes profound. You could be the only real consciousness in your entire world, surrounded by philosophical zombies who act conscious but have no inner experience. Or perhaps you're the zombie, lacking consciousness while perfectly simulating it, even to yourself. But here's where the paradox becomes recursive. If you're worried about being simulated and that worry affects your behavior, then the simulation has to account for beings who are aware they might be simulated. This creates nested levels of simulation. Simulated beings wondering if they're simulated, which affects how they behave, which affects how the simulation runs. The civilization running your simulation might be dealing with their own simulation hypothesis. They could be simulated beings who've created you as a simulation within their simulation. This creates an infinite regress, simulations all the way down with no base reality anywhere. Some argue that a civilization advanced enough to run ancestor simulations would have no reason to simulate suffering, but look around. Your world contains immense pain, injustice, and cruelty. Either your simulators are incredibly callous, or they're running a historically accurate simulation that includes humanity's darker impulses, or suffering serves some computational purpose you can't understand, the ethical implications are staggering. If you're simulated, do your actions have moral weight? If the people around you aren't real, do you have obligations toward them? Or conversely, if everyone else is real but trapped in a simulation with you, are you morally obligated to try to wake them up, even if it might cause existential terror? Perhaps most unsettling is the possibility that knowledge of the simulation could trigger its termination. If too many simulated beings become aware of their nature, the programmers might end the simulation to prevent computational instability. By contemplating whether you're simulated, you might be hastening your own non-existence. Yet you cannot stop thinking about it. The idea has infected your mind like a virus, changing how you perceive every experience. Colors might seem less vibrant, knowing they could be mere data. Relationships might feel less meaningful, knowing the other person might be code. Even your most profound experiences become suspect. Are they genuine moments of transcendence or carefully programmed emotional responses? The simulation hypothesis creates a perfect prison. It cannot be proven or disproven from within the system. You're trapped in epistemological uncertainty, unable to trust your senses or reasoning since both could be simulated. Reality becomes a matter of faith rather than evidence. And perhaps that's the point. Whether you're in base reality or the deepest level of simulation doesn't change your immediate experience. You still feel, think, hope, and dream. The simulation, if perfect, is indistinguishable from reality, which means it effectively is reality for you. As consciousness fades towards sleep, consider this. If you dream tonight, you'll experience a simulation within a potential simulation. Layers of unreality stacked upon each other, each feeling completely real while you're experiencing it. Sweet dreams. If dreams are what you're actually having. Who is reading these words right now? You might think the answer is obvious. You are. But what is you? Where does the self begin and end? What makes you continuous with the person who woke up this morning, went to sleep last night, or existed as a child decades ago? The more closely you examine the sense of self, the more it dissolves under scrutiny like sugar in water. You cannot find a fixed, unchanging core that persists through time. Your thoughts are constantly changing, your body is continuously regenerating, your personality evolves, your memories fade and transform. So what exactly is the you that you're so certain exists? Consider split-brain patients, people whose corpus callosum, the bridge between brain hemispheres, has been severed to treat severe epilepsy. In these individuals, the left and right halves of the brain can disagree, creating two separate streams of consciousness in one body. The left hand might unbutton a shirt while the right hand buttons it up. Two different personalities can emerge, each unaware of the other's thoughts and intentions. Which hemisphere contains the real person? Are there now two people sharing one body? If consciousness can be divided, what does this say about the unity of self that you take for granted? Your sense of being a single, coherent entity might be an illusion created by the constant communication between brain regions, an illusion that can be surgically broken. The bundle theory of personal identity suggests that what you call self is nothing more than a collection of perceptions, thoughts, and experiences bundled together by memory and continuity of body. Like a river that maintains its identity despite constantly flowing water, you maintain your sense of self despite the constant flow of mental contents. But a river is just a pattern of water flow. Is the self just a pattern of mental flow? Think about your memories. They feel like records of your past, proof of your continuous existence, but neuroscience reveals that every time you remember something, you're actually reconstructing it. Each recall changes the memory slightly, adding details from your current perspective, subtracting elements that no longer seem important. Your past is constantly being rewritten by your present self, which means your identity is built on shifting foundations. The Ship of Theseus paradox applies directly to personal identity. If every cell in your body is replaced over time and every memory is reconstructed with each recall, in what sense are you the same person who existed 7 years ago? You share neither physical matter nor unchanged memories with your past self. The continuity of identity is a story you tell yourself, not a biological or psychological fact. But the paradox becomes more disturbing when you consider multiple personality disorder, now called dissociative identity disorder. Some individuals house multiple distinct personalities, each with their own memories, preferences, and ways of relating to the world. These personalities can be so separate that one might be allergic to a substance that another tolerates, or one might need prescription glasses while another has perfect vision. If multiple personalities can inhabit one body, this suggests that identity is more fluid and arbitrary than we assume. What we think of as our unified self might be similar to a multiple personality system, just with better integration between different aspects of our psyche. The you that's focused at work might be genuinely different from the you that's intimate with a loved one, which might be different from the you that's alone with your thoughts. The narrative theory of identity argues that you are the story you tell about yourself. But this creates another paradox. Who is telling the story? If the self is just a narrative, then the narrator must exist independently of the narrative. But then what is the narrator made of? And if the narrator is also just another story, you end up with an infinite regress of stories telling stories. Contemporary neuroscience suggests that consciousness isn't generated by a single brain region, but emerges from the complex interactions of multiple systems. There's no seat of consciousness, no central command center, where decisions are made and experiences are unified. The sense of being a unified self, experiencing the world from a single point of view, is a construction, a useful fiction created by the brain to coordinate behavior. This raises the possibility that you're not one entity having multiple experiences, but multiple processes creating the illusion of unified experience. The you that's thinking about this paradox, the you that's lying in bed, the you that's planning tomorrow's activities, these might be different subsystems of consciousness taking turns dominating awareness, like improvisational actors sharing a stage. The Buddhist concept of anatta, or non-self, suggests that the search for a permanent, unchanging self is fundamentally misguided. What we think of as the self is just a collection of ever-changing physical and mental processes. There's no driver of the car, just the car driving itself. There's no thinker of thoughts, just thinking happening. There's no experiencer of experience, just experiencing occurring. But if there's no self, who suffers, who enjoys, who makes moral choices and bears responsibility for actions? The absence of a fixed self doesn't eliminate the reality of pain, pleasure, and ethical decision-making. It just makes their nature more mysterious. Consider the paradox of self-reference. You can think about your own thinking, be aware of your own awareness, observe your own observations. This creates recursive loops where consciousness folds back on itself. But if there's no fixed self doing the thinking, what exactly is becoming aware of awareness? It's like trying to see your own eyes without a mirror. The observer and the observed are the same thing, making objective self-knowledge impossible. The problem deepens when you realize that your sense of being a continuous self is largely dependent on memory, but memory is notoriously unreliable. False memories can feel as real as true ones. Childhood memories are often constructed from photographs, stories, and fragments rather than actual recall. If your sense of continuous identity depends on unreliable memory, then the self is built on quicksand. As you drift towards sleep, notice how consciousness becomes fragmented. The logical, verbal part of your mind begins to quiet, while emotional and imagistic processes take over. The boundaries of self become fluid as you enter the dream state, where you might be multiple people in one dream or transform into someone else entirely. Who will you be when you wake up? And who will remember being you? Right now, as you focus on these words, you're not just reading about reality, you're creating it. The act of observation doesn't just reveal what's there, it fundamentally changes what's there. This isn't mystical speculation, it's one of the most well-established and deeply unsettling facts about the nature of existence. In quantum mechanics, particles exist in multiple states simultaneously until observed. An electron can be spinning in multiple directions at once, existing in what physicists call a superposition. But the moment you measure it, the superposition collapses, and the particle chooses a single state. The act of looking forces reality to decide what it wants to be. This isn't just about tiny particles you'll never see. Quantum effects scale up in ways that make the familiar world strange. The atoms in your body, the molecules in the air you breathe, the neurons firing in your brain, they're all subject to quantum mechanics. At the deepest level, your physical reality is indeterminate until observed. But who or what counts as an observer? Does it require consciousness, or is any interaction with the environment sufficient? Some interpretations suggest that consciousness plays a fundamental role in collapsing wave functions, which would mean that awareness literally creates the physical world. Others argue that any measurement device, conscious or not, can collapse superposition. If consciousness is required for observation, this creates a profound paradox. How did the universe exist before conscious beings evolved to observe it? Did reality remain in quantum superposition for billions of years until the first conscious mind emerged to collapse it? Or does this suggest that consciousness is more fundamental than we assume, perhaps a basic feature of the universe rather than an emergent property of complex brains? The delayed choice quantum eraser experiments make this even more mysterious. Scientists can determine whether a photon behaved as a wave or particle after it has already been detected, retroactively determining its history. This suggests that future observations can influence past events, scrambling our understanding of causation and time. Consider what this means for your personal reality. Every time you turn your attention to something, you're potentially changing it at the quantum level. Your thoughts, focused on your body, might be influencing the physical processes within it. Your observation of other people might be affecting their quantum states in ways neither of you can detect. The measurement problem in quantum mechanics asks, when exactly does the transition from quantum possibility to classical certainty occur? There's no clear boundary between the microscopic quantum world and the macroscopic classical world. If quantum effects can scale up, and experiments suggest they can, then the everyday objects around you might exist in superposition until you observe them. This leads to the many worlds interpretation, which suggests that every quantum measurement splits the universe into multiple parallel realities. In some worlds, you chose to listen to this tonight. In others, you decided to do something else. Every moment, reality branches into countless versions, each equally real, containing different versions of you living different lives. From this perspective, you're not experiencing one timeline, but simultaneously existing across infinite parallel universes. The you that's listening to these words is just one facet of a multidimensional entity spread across countless realities. Your other selves are making different choices, thinking different thoughts, living different lives, and they're all equally real. But the observer effect extends beyond physics into neuroscience and psychology. The act of introspection changes the very mental processes you're trying to observe. When you pay attention to your breathing, you alter your breathing pattern. When you monitor your thoughts, you change the flow of thinking. When you examine your emotions, you influence their intensity and duration. This creates a fundamental problem for self-knowledge. You cannot objectively observe your own mind because the act of observation changes what you're observing. It's like trying to measure the temperature of water with a thermometer that significantly heats or cools the water. The measurement itself makes accurate reading impossible. The placebo and nocebo effects demonstrate how observation and expectation can create physical reality. Believing a treatment will work can make it work even when the treatment is inert. Expecting negative side effects can create those effects in the absence of any active agent. Your beliefs about your health can literally make you healthier or sicker. This suggests that the boundary between subjective experience and objective reality is more porous than we assume. Your mental states aren't just responses to physical reality, they're participants in creating that reality. The observer isn't separate from the observed, they're aspects of a single, interconnected system. In relationships, the observer effect becomes interpersonal. How you perceive someone influences how they behave, which influences how you perceive them, creating feedback loops that make it impossible to determine where one person ends and another begins. You're not just observing the people in your life, you're continuously creating them through your observations, just as they're creating you through theirs. The double-slit experiment, quantum mechanics' most famous demonstration, shows that particles can behave as waves or particles depending on how they're observed. But recent experiments suggest that the mere possibility of observation can affect particle behavior, even if no actual observation occurs. Reality seems to respond not just to what we do, but to what we could potentially do. This raises the possibility that consciousness doesn't just observe reality, it participates in the ongoing creation of reality. Your awareness isn't a spotlight illuminating a pre-existing world. It's more like a dance partner moving with reality in ways that make it impossible to determine who's leading. The information integration theory of consciousness suggests that consciousness is fundamentally about integrating information from multiple sources into a unified experience. But if consciousness integrates information, and information is the fundamental substrate of reality, as some physicists propose, then consciousness might be reality's way of knowing itself. As you lie there becoming aware of your awareness, notice the strange recursive quality of consciousness observing consciousness. You're using your mind to examine your mind, creating an infinite loop where the observer and the observed merge into something that transcends both. Perhaps most disturbing of all, if observation creates reality, then by thinking about these ideas, you're changing the nature of the reality you inhabit. These thoughts aren't just describing the world, they're reshaping it. The observer effect suggests that there's no view from nowhere, no objective perspective outside the system of reality. You're always inside what you're trying to understand, always changing what you're trying to measure, always creating what you think you're discovering. What are you creating right now? Imagine you travel back in time and give Shakespeare a book containing all of his plays. He reads them, loves them, and decides to copy them word for word, publishing them as his own work. You return to your present time, where these plays are still attributed to Shakespeare. But here's the question that should make your mind reel. Who actually wrote the plays? Shakespeare didn't create them, he copied them from a book you gave him. But you didn't write them either, you got them from history books that credited Shakespeare. The information exists without an origin point, trapped in a causal loop where effect precedes cause and causation eats its own tail. This is the bootstrap paradox, named after the impossible feat of pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps. It's a temporal paradox where information or objects exist without having been created by anyone or anything. They simply are, popping into existence through the strange mathematics of circular causation. But the bootstrap paradox isn't confined to time travel stories. It might be woven into the very fabric of reality itself. Consider the question that has haunted philosophers and cosmologists for millennia. Why is there something rather than nothing? Every answer seems to require something to already exist to explain why something exists, creating an infinite regress that never reaches a satisfactory starting point. The Big Bang Theory tells us the universe expanded from an initial singularity, but what caused the singularity? If quantum fluctuations in a vacuum created it, what created the vacuum and the laws that govern quantum fluctuations? If God created the universe, what created God? Each explanation pushes the mystery back one step without actually solving the fundamental puzzle of existence. Perhaps existence itself is a bootstrap paradox. Maybe the universe exists because it exists, creating itself through some incomprehensible loop of circular causation. The laws of physics might be self-creating, existing because they make possible a universe in which they can exist. Reality bootstraps itself into being through sheer logical necessity. This possibility becomes more plausible when you consider the anthropic principle. The fundamental constants of physics are fine-tuned to an extraordinary degree to allow for the existence of stars, planets, and life. If the strong nuclear force was slightly different, atoms couldn't form. If gravity was slightly stronger or weaker, stars couldn't ignite or planets couldn't form stable orbits. Some argue this fine-tuning points to a designer, but there's another possibility. Perhaps universes that allow for the existence of observers are the only ones that can actually exist. Consciousness might be necessary to collapse quantum wave functions and bring reality into being. This would mean that the universe exists because conscious beings exist to observe it, but conscious beings exist because the universe is fine-tuned to produce them. Another bootstrap loop. In quantum mechanics, virtual particles pop into existence from the vacuum, exist for impossibly brief moments, then annihilate each other and disappear. But these temporary fluctuations in the quantum field have real effects. They contribute to the Casimir effect and influence the behavior of atoms. Reality is constantly creating itself from nothing, then disappearing back into nothing in an endless dance of bootstrap creation. The observer effect in quantum mechanics creates its own bootstrap paradoxes. If consciousness is necessary to collapse wave functions and create definite reality, then consciousness creates the physical universe. But consciousness emerges from complex arrangements of matter in the physical universe. So consciousness creates the universe that creates consciousness, another perfect bootstrap loop. Information theory suggests that reality might be fundamentally computational. If the universe is a vast information processing system, then perhaps information creates itself through recursive loops. The universe computes its own existence, running algorithms that generate the very hardware on which they run. Reality becomes self-writing code, bootstrapping itself into existence through pure mathematics. Consider the strange loops in consciousness itself. You are aware that you are aware, creating a recursive structure where consciousness observes consciousness, observing consciousness, ad infinitum. Your sense of self might be a bootstrap phenomenon, the self existing because it believes it exists, creating itself through the very act of self-recognition. Language might be humanity's greatest bootstrap creation. Words get their meaning from their relationships to other words, which get their meaning from their relationships to still other words. The entire system of meaning is self-referential, with no external foundation. Language creates itself through use, bootstrapping meaning into existence through circular definition. DNA replicates itself, but it needs proteins to do so, proteins that are coded for by DNA. Life bootstraps itself through this molecular chicken and egg paradox, where genetic information creates the machinery needed to preserve and transmit genetic information. The origin of life might itself be a bootstrap event where chemistry became complex enough to create chemistry. In mathematics, certain systems appear to be self-justifying. The axioms of mathematics aren't proven, they're assumed to be true because they lead to consistent and useful systems. Mathematics might bootstrap itself into truth through its own internal logic, existing because it's logically necessary for it to exist. The bootstrap paradox raises disturbing questions about the nature of causation itself. If effects can precede causes, if information can exist without origin, if systems can create themselves, then our basic understanding of how reality works might be fundamentally flawed. Perhaps the most unsettling possibility is that you yourself might be a bootstrap phenomenon. Your consciousness, your memories, your sense of continuous identity, what if these exist without ultimate origin? What if the you experiencing these thoughts is self-creating, existing in a temporal loop where your future self influences your past self in ways that make your present self possible? Every time you make a decision based on imagining future consequences, you're creating a kind of bootstrap loop. Your present action is caused by a future that hasn't happened yet, which is caused by the present action you're taking now. Free will, if it exists, might be a bootstrap phenomenon where choice creates the conditions for choice. The bootstrap paradox suggests that questions about ultimate origins might be meaningless. Instead of asking what caused the first cause, we might need to accept that some things simply exist in causal loops with no beginning or end. Reality might be fundamentally circular, with no linear progression from cause to effect, but an eternal dance of mutual creation. As you drift towards sleep, consider this. Your dreams tonight might influence your waking thoughts tomorrow, which will influence your dreams tomorrow night, which influenced your dreams last night through some impossible loop of causation that transcends linear time. You might be dreaming yourself into existence right now, creating the very consciousness that will dream you again tomorrow. The bootstrap paradox leaves us with questions that spiral back on themselves. If everything creates everything else, what creates creation itself? Close your eyes for a moment and simply exist. Feel the weight of your body against the bed, the rhythm of your breathing, the flow of thoughts through your mind. Now ask yourself the most basic and most impossible question. What is this experience you're having? What is consciousness? You know you're conscious because you're having subjective experiences right now. The redness of red, the painfulness of pain, the sense of being a unified self observing the world from a single point of view. But how does mere matter arranged in certain patterns give rise to inner experience? How do neural firings in your brain create the felt sense of being you? This is the hard problem of consciousness, and it might be the deepest mystery in existence. We can explain cognitive functions, how the brain processes information, forms memories, makes decisions. But we cannot explain why there's something it's like to be conscious. Why isn't all this processing happening in the dark, without any inner experience accompanying it? Consider the philosophical zombie argument. It's possible to imagine a being physically identical to you, same brain structure, same neural activity, same behavioral responses, but with no inner experience. This zombie would act conscious, claim to be conscious, even write philosophy papers about consciousness, but there would be nothing it's like to be this being. No inner movie, no subjective experience, just behavioral responses without awareness. If zombies are conceivable, this suggests that consciousness is something over and above physical processes. But if consciousness is non-physical, how does it interact with the physical brain? How does an immaterial mind influence material neurons? This is the mind-body problem that has plagued philosophy for centuries. Some argue that consciousness must be fundamental to reality, like mass or charge, a basic feature of the universe rather than something that emerges from complex arrangements of matter. This panpsychist view suggests that electrons have rudimentary experiences, that consciousness goes all the way down to the bottom of reality. Your awareness would be composed of countless micro-experiences in the particles that make up your brain. But this creates its own mysteries. How do billions of separate micro-experiences combine into your unified consciousness? Why don't you experience the consciousness of your individual neurons? This is the combination problem. How does distributed consciousness become unified consciousness? The integrated information theory proposes that consciousness corresponds to integrated information in a system. The more information a system integrates, the more conscious it is. But this theory suggests that many non-biological systems, including some computer networks, might be conscious. It also implies that your smartphone might have some rudimentary form of experience. Even stranger, the theory suggests that conscious systems can overlap. Parts of your brain might constitute separate conscious entities, meaning multiple consciousnesses could be inhabiting your skull right now without your knowledge. You might be a society of minds rather than a single unified consciousness. The global workspace theory argues that consciousness arises when information becomes globally available across the brain, when data from multiple specialized modules gets broadcast to the entire neural network. But this explains the function of consciousness, not the experience. Why should global information integration feel like anything from the inside? Some philosophers argue that the hard problem is a category error, that asking why physical processes give rise to experience is like asking why a circle is round. Consciousness might be identical to certain brain states, not caused by them. Your experience of pain wouldn't be produced by neural activity, it would be neural activity, seen from the inside. But this doesn't resolve the mystery, it just relocates it. Why should some neural activity be experiential while other patterns of activity are not? What makes certain physical processes subjective while others remain objective? The qualitative nature of experience seems fundamentally different from the quantitative nature of neural activity. The timing of consciousness creates additional puzzles. Your experience of the present moment actually integrates information from slightly different times. Visual processing, auditory processing, and tactile processing all operate at different speeds, yet you experience them as simultaneous. Your brain constructs the illusion of now by binding together information from the recent past. This means your conscious experience is always slightly behind reality, a delayed reconstruction rather than a real-time awareness. The you experiencing this moment is actually experiencing a moment that has already passed. You're living in the past while thinking you're in the present. Binocular rivalry experiments reveal how unstable consciousness actually is. When different images are presented to each eye, consciousness alternates between them. You see one image, then the other, never both simultaneously. This suggests that consciousness isn't a continuous stream, but a series of discrete snapshots stitched together by memory into the illusion of continuity. The binding problem asks how the brain combines separate features, color, shape, motion, sound, into unified perceptual objects. When you see a red ball bouncing, separate neural systems process the redness, the roundness, and the motion. How does the brain bind these separate processes into the experience of a single, moving red ball? Some propose that consciousness requires temporal synchrony, neurons firing in rhythm across different brain regions, but others argue for attention-based theories, where consciousness emerges from the brain's attention mechanisms. Still others suggest that consciousness is essentially about prediction, the brain's model of what's happening right now. The neural correlates of consciousness, the minimal neural mechanisms sufficient for specific conscious experiences, remain elusive. Scientists can identify brain areas associated with consciousness, but correlation isn't causation. Finding neural activity that accompanies awareness doesn't explain how neural activity becomes awareness. Perhaps most disturbing is the possibility that consciousness is an illusion. Maybe there's no central observer, no unified self, no inner theater where experiences are displayed. Maybe consciousness is just a story the brain tells itself about its own processes, a useful fiction that helps coordinate behavior but doesn't correspond to anything real. If consciousness is illusory, then what you think you're experiencing right now, the sense of being a unified self, having thoughts and feelings, would be a mirage. There would be thinking without a thinker, experiencing without an experiencer, being without anyone who is. But this creates a paradox. Who or what is experiencing the illusion of consciousness? An illusion requires someone to be fooled. If there's no conscious observer, there can be no illusion of consciousness, which means consciousness must be real after all. As you lie there being conscious of being conscious, you're confronting the deepest mystery of existence. The fact that you're aware of these words, that there's something it's like to be you, might be the most extraordinary and inexplicable fact in the universe. What is it like to be you, and why is it like anything at all? Consider this statement. This sentence is false. If the sentence is true, then it must be false as it claims, but if it's false, then it must be true since it accurately describes itself as false. The sentence cannot be consistently assigned a truth value. It's neither true nor false, or perhaps both true and false simultaneously. This is the liar's paradox, and it's not just a clever word game. It reveals a fundamental crack in the foundation of logic itself, suggesting that the very concept of truth might be inherently unstable. When language becomes self-referential, when statements refer to themselves, the orderly world of true and false collapses into paradox. The ancient Greeks discovered this paradox over 2 millennia ago, but it has only become more troubling as we've learned more about language, mathematics, and computation. It's not an error we can fix. It seems to be an inherent feature of any system rich enough to refer to itself. Consider a more subtle version. I am lying right now. If this statement is true, then you're not lying, which makes the statement false. But if it's false, then you are lying, which makes the statement true. Again, we're trapped in a logical loop with no exit. This isn't just about language, it infects mathematics too. Gödel's incompleteness theorems show that any mathematical system sophisticated enough to do basic arithmetic must contain statements that cannot be proven true or false within that system. Mathematics, the supposed pinnacle of logical certainty, contains irreducible uncertainties at its heart. Russell's paradox demonstrates this in set theory. Consider the set of all sets that do not contain themselves. Does this set contain itself? If it does, then it shouldn't, according to its definition. If it doesn't, then it should. The very foundations of mathematics become contradictory when they become self-referential. But the paradox goes deeper than formal logic. Every time you think about thinking, you create a similar recursive structure. When you observe your own mind, what is doing the observing? When you're aware of your awareness, what is aware of that awareness? It's observers all the way up, with no final observer to ground the infinite regress. The truth predicate itself becomes problematic. When you say it's true that snow is white, what exactly are you adding by including it's true that? Truth seems to be a property that statements have, but when we try to analyze what truth means, we end up in circular definitions. Truth is correspondence with reality, but what makes correspondence itself true? Tarski's solution was to suggest that truth must be defined in a meta-language, a language that talks about the object language but doesn't include itself. But this just pushes the problem up a level. What about the truth of statements in the meta-language? You need a meta-meta-language and then a meta-meta-meta-language in an infinite hierarchy that never reaches solid ground. This creates what philosophers call the semantic paradoxes, paradoxes that arise from the interaction between language and meaning. They suggest that natural language might be inherently inconsistent, that the very tool we use to think about reality contains contradictions that make coherent thought impossible. The strengthened liar. Paradox makes the problem even worse. Consider, this sentence is either false or meaningless. If it's true, then it's false or meaningless, which means it's not true. If it's false, then it's not the case that it's false or meaningless, which means it's true and meaningful. If it's meaningless, then we can't evaluate whether it's false or meaningless. Every possible option leads to contradiction. Some philosophers have proposed that these sentences are simply meaningless. They look like statements, but don't actually express propositions. But this creates the paradox of analysis. How can we determine that something is meaningless without understanding what it means? And if we understand what it means well enough to determine it's meaningless, then it must be meaningful after all. The problem extends to belief and knowledge. Consider, I believe this statement is false. Do you believe it or not? If you believe it, then you believe it's false, which means you don't believe it. If you don't believe it, then it's false, which means you should believe it. Your beliefs about your own beliefs become unstable and contradictory. This connects to the problem of self-knowledge. Can you ever fully know your own mind? The very act of introspection changes what you're trying to observe. When you pay attention to your mental states, you alter them. The observer effect in psychology means that self-knowledge is always partial and distorted. The paradox appears in ethics too. Consider moral relativism, the view that moral truths are relative to cultures or individuals. If moral relativism is true, then the statement, moral relativism is true, is only true relative to those who believe it. But this means it's not absolutely true, which contradicts its claim to be true about the nature of moral truth. Even logic itself becomes paradoxical. The law of non-contradiction states that contradictory statements cannot both be true. But what if someone rejects the law of non-contradiction? Can we use logic to prove that logic is valid without circular reasoning? Our most basic logical principles cannot be justified without assuming the very principles we're trying to justify. The liar's paradox reveals something disturbing about the nature of self-reference. Whenever a system becomes complex enough to refer to itself, whether it's language, mathematics, consciousness, or knowledge, it seems to generate paradoxes that threaten its coherence. Self-reference is both necessary for sophisticated thought and potentially destructive to logical consistency. Perhaps most unsettling is the possibility that the paradox applies to this very analysis. This exploration of the liar's paradox uses language to examine language, logic to analyze logic, truth to investigate truth. If the paradox is fundamental, then this entire discussion might be undermining itself, true and false simultaneously, meaningful and meaningless, enlightening and confused. Consider the strange loop you're in right now. You're using your mind to examine the paradoxes of mind, using language to explore the contradictions of language, using reason to investigate the limits of reason. The observer and the observed collapse into each other, creating an infinite regress of self-reference. As your consciousness begins to fade towards sleep, carry this question with you. If truth itself is paradoxical, what does it mean to seek truth? And if seeking truth is paradoxical, what are you doing right now? The liar's paradox suggests that reality might be fundamentally contradictory, that existence itself might be caught in logical loops that never resolve. Sweet dreams if consistency allows for such things. The more you learn, the more you realize you don't know. This isn't just a cliché, it's a fundamental paradox about the nature of knowledge itself. Every answer generates new questions, every solution reveals deeper mysteries, every step toward understanding shows you how much further you have to go. Knowledge doesn't satisfy curiosity. It feeds it, creating an infinite hunger that grows stronger with every meal. Consider what you knew as a child versus what you know now. Your knowledge has expanded exponentially, yet your sense of mystery about the world has likely deepened rather than diminished. As a child, you might have thought adults had figured everything out. Now you know that expertise often means becoming more aware of what you don't understand. This is the paradox of the expert. The more someone knows about a field, the more they understand its limitations, uncertainties, and unanswered questions. True expertise begins with recognizing the boundaries of knowledge, not with claiming to have transcended them. The wisest people are often those most aware of their own ignorance. Socrates captured this paradox when he claimed to know only that he knew nothing. His wisdom lay not in accumulating facts, but in recognizing the limits of human understanding. The Oracle of Delphi declared him the wisest man in Athens precisely because he alone understood how little he truly knew. But the paradox goes deeper than humility. There seem to be fundamental limits to what any conscious being can know about reality. Gödel's incompleteness theorems show that even mathematics, our most rigorous form of knowledge, contains truths that cannot be proven within the system. No mathematical system can be both complete and consistent. There will always be true statements that cannot be derived from the axioms. This limitation isn't just technical, it suggests something profound about the relationship between mind and reality. Any system complex enough to be interesting will contain statements about itself that it cannot evaluate. Knowledge systems seem inherently incapable of fully understanding themselves. The measurement problem in quantum mechanics reveals similar limits in physics. We can predict probabilities of quantum events with extraordinary precision, but we cannot know both the position and momentum of a particle simultaneously. The Heisenberg uncertainty principle isn't just about measurement limitations, it might represent a fundamental indeterminacy in nature itself. Even more disturbing, quantum mechanics suggests that the act of observation changes what's being observed. This means that perfect knowledge of a system is impossible in principle, not just in practice. The universe seems designed to resist complete understanding, as if knowledge itself changes the nature of what can be known. The problem of other minds illustrates the epistemological isolation of consciousness. You can never directly access another person's subjective experience. You can observe their behavior, listen to their reports, even scan their brains, but you cannot feel their pain or see their mental images. The inner life of others remains forever mysterious, no matter how much you learn about them. This extends to your own mind. Introspection has limits. You cannot fully observe your own consciousness without changing it. The very act of turning attention inward alters the mental processes you're trying to examine. Self-knowledge is limited not by lack of access, but by the paradoxical nature of self-observation. Consider the frame problem in artificial intelligence. How do you give a machine enough knowledge to operate in the world without giving it too much? The amount of potentially relevant information is infinite. To know that it's safe to move a chair, an AI would need to know that moving the chair won't cause the ceiling to collapse, won't trigger a nuclear war, won't violate the laws of physics in unexpected ways. Complete knowledge would require knowing everything about everything. Humans solve the frame problem through ignorance. We ignore most of what might be relevant and focus on what seems important. Our effectiveness comes not from comprehensive knowledge, but from selective attention and useful ignorance. Wisdom might be knowing what not to think about. The problem of induction reveals fundamental limits in reasoning from experience. You've seen the sun rise every day of your life, but this doesn't logically guarantee it will rise tomorrow. No amount of past experience can definitively prove future regularities. All empirical knowledge rests on assumptions that cannot themselves be empirically justified. Scientific knowledge advances through paradigm shifts that often reveal the inadequacy of previous understanding. Newton's physics seemed complete until Einstein showed its limitations. Quantum mechanics replaced classical certainty with probabilistic knowledge. Each revolution in understanding reveals how much the previous paradigm missed. This suggests that current scientific knowledge might be similarly limited. Future discoveries could show that our best theories are as incomplete as Aristotelian physics seems to us now. The history of science is a history of confident claims later revealed to be partial or mistaken. The combinatorial explosion problem shows how quickly the possible exceeds the knowable. Chess has more possible games than there are atoms in the observable universe. Go has even more possibilities. The number of potential sentences in English is infinite. Reality contains more possible states than any mind could ever examine. Language itself limits what can be known by constraining what can be thought. Each language carves up reality differently, highlighting some aspects while obscuring others. The untranslatable words in other languages point to experiences and concepts that your linguistic framework cannot capture. You are trapped in a conceptual prison whose walls you cannot see. The Chinese room argument suggests that even perfect behavioral knowledge might miss essential features of consciousness. A person could follow rules for responding to Chinese characters without understanding Chinese. Similarly, complete knowledge of brain states might not reveal the nature of subjective experience. The hard problem of consciousness might be unsolvable in principle. Perhaps most unsettling is the possibility that knowledge itself is relative to the knower. What counts as knowledge depends on cognitive architecture, sensory capabilities, cultural background, and historical context. There might be no view from nowhere, no objective standpoint from which absolute truth can be perceived. This creates infinite regress. To know something, you need to know how to know it. But to know how to know something, you need to know how to know it. The foundations of knowledge rest on assumptions that cannot be independently verified without circular reasoning. As you drift towards sleep, consider that your very capacity for knowledge might be both humanity's greatest achievement and its fundamental limitation. You are a pattern-seeking creature in a reality that might ultimately transcend all patterns, a meaning-making being in a universe that might be inherently meaningless. The paradox of knowledge leaves you suspended between ignorance and understanding, always knowing enough to know you don't know enough. What don't you know that you don't know? Time is the most familiar and most mysterious aspect of your existence. You move through it moment by moment, aging second by second, yet when you try to grasp what time actually is, it slips away like water through your fingers. The deeper physics probes the nature of time, the more paradoxical and uncertain it becomes. Einstein showed that time is relative. It passes differently for observers moving at different speeds or in different gravitational fields. Your head ages slightly faster than your feet because gravity is weaker the farther you are from Earth's center. This isn't just theoretical. GPS satellites must correct for time dilation, or their navigation would be wildly inaccurate. Time literally runs differently at different speeds and locations. But if time is relative, what does now mean? When you think this is happening now, which reference frame determines simultaneity? Events that are simultaneous in one reference frame occur at different times in another. There's no universal present moment, no cosmic now that spans the universe. The present is local and relative, not absolute and universal. This relativity of simultaneity creates profound paradoxes. If you're moving relative to distant events, you can change which events are happening now simply by changing your speed. In some reference frames, distant civilizations are experiencing events that in other frames won't happen for thousands of years. The universe contains all time simultaneously, with no objective ordering of past, present, and future. The block universe theory suggests that all moments in time exist equally. Past, present, and future are equally real, laid out like frames in a film strip. From this perspective, your birth, your death, and every moment in between all exist simultaneously in the four-dimensional space-time manifold. Your sense of moving through time from past to future would be a subjective illusion, like the way a train passenger experiences the landscape flowing by. But this creates the paradox of experience. If all moments exist equally, why do you experience them sequentially? Why does consciousness seem to flow from past to future rather than experiencing all times simultaneously? The subjective arrow of time, your feeling of temporal passage, becomes mysterious if time is really a static dimension like space. The thermodynamic arrow of time offers one explanation. Entropy increases over time, giving time a direction. Hot coffee cools down, it never spontaneously heats up. Eggs break, but don't unbreak. The second law of thermodynamics seems to define a direction for time, but this just pushes the mystery back. Why did the universe start in a low entropy state that allows entropy to increase? Quantum mechanics introduces additional temporal mysteries. The uncertainty principle applies to time and energy. You cannot know exactly when a quantum event will occur and how much energy is involved. This suggests that time itself might be fundamentally indeterminate at the quantum level. Quantum experiments seem to show that future measurements can influence past events. In delayed choice experiments, decisions made after photons have already been detected can retroactively determine whether they behaved as waves or particles. This suggests that causation might run backward in time, that effects can precede their causes. The grandfather paradox illustrates the logical problems with backward causation. If you travel back in time and prevent your grandparents from meeting, you prevent your own birth. But if you're never born, you can't travel back to prevent their meeting. This creates a logical contradiction that seems to make backward time travel impossible. Various solutions have been proposed. Maybe time travel creates alternate timelines, or maybe the universe has self-consistency principles that prevent paradoxes. Perhaps the Novikov self-consistency principle ensures that any time travel was always part of history. You can't change the past because your time travel was always part of how the past happened. But even forward time travel creates paradoxes. Einstein's relativity allows for legitimate time travel to the future through time dilation, travel at high speed or in strong gravitational fields, and less time passes for you than for everyone else. You could travel years into the future in days or hours of your own time. This raises questions about personal identity across time. If you time travel to the future, are you the same person who left, or have you become someone else? If time travel is possible, what maintains the continuity of consciousness across temporal gaps? Your memories would remain intact, but you would have skipped the experiences that shaped everyone else. The presentist view argues that only the present moment exists. The past has ceased to be, and the future doesn't exist yet. But this conflicts with relativity's relative simultaneity. Whose present moment is the real one? How can only one reference frame's now be privileged when physics shows that simultaneity is relative? The growing block theory tries to compromise. The past and present exist, but the future is still coming into being. Time is like a growing crystal with new moments crystallizing into existence as the universe evolves. But this raises the question of what determines the rate of temporal growth. How fast does the present moment move from past to future? Eternalism suggests that all moments exist equally and tenselessly. When you say, "I was born," you're making a statement about the relationship between your current temporal location and your birth event, not claiming that your birth no longer exists. From this view, death isn't the end of existence, but just the temporal boundary of your world line in space-time. But eternalism makes it hard to understand change and causation. If all times exist equally, in what sense do causes precede effects? How can anything really change if all states exist simultaneously? The dynamic, flowing quality of experience becomes an illusion that needs explaining rather than a fundamental feature of reality. The measurement of time itself is paradoxical. Every clock measures time by comparing one process, its mechanism, to another, its timing. But this assumes that different processes have consistent relationships across time. How do we know that atomic clocks run at constant rates? We can only compare them to other clocks, creating circular reasoning about the nature of temporal measurement. Perhaps most disturbing is the possibility that time might not exist at all. Some interpretations of quantum gravity suggest that time emerges from more fundamental timeless processes. At the deepest level of reality, there might be no such thing as temporal flow, no before and after, no causation or change. Time might be like temperature, a statistical property that emerges from underlying microscopic processes but has no fundamental reality. As you lie there feeling time pass, feeling yourself moving from one moment to the next, consider that this most basic aspect of your experience might be the most profound illusion of all. What time is it when time doesn't exist? Right now, you think you understand these words. You believe meaning is flowing from symbols on a screen into your consciousness, creating thoughts and feelings that weren't there before. But what if understanding is an illusion? What if communication is impossible and we're all trapped in private linguistic worlds with no way to verify that we mean the same things by the same words? Consider the word red. You point to a strawberry and say it's red. I agree. But how do you know that the experience I call red matches the experience you call red? What if the inner experience you have when looking at strawberries is what I would call blue, but we've both learned to call this particular experience red? Our behaviors would match perfectly, but our inner experiences could be completely different. This is the problem of inverted spectra, and it generalizes to all mental content. Pain, joy, fear, love. You have no way to verify that these words refer to the same experiences in different minds. We could be living in completely different subjective worlds while using identical language to describe them. Communication would be a perfectly synchronized dance of mutual misunderstanding. Wittgenstein's private language argument suggests that language cannot refer to private mental states at all. Words get their meaning from their role in public language games, not from their connection to inner experiences. When you say, "I'm in pain," you're not reporting on a private mental event, but participating in a behavioral pattern that includes wincing, seeking help, and avoiding the source of pain. But this makes consciousness invisible to language. If words cannot refer to subjective experiences, then the most intimate aspects of your mental life remain forever unnameable and uncommunicable. You are alone with your consciousness, surrounded by others who speak your language but cannot share your experience. The indeterminacy of translation reveals deeper problems with meaning. When anthropologists encounter isolated cultures, how do they know they're translating correctly? The word gavagai might mean rabbit, undetached rabbit parts, temporal stage of a rabbit, or something else entirely. Without independent access to meaning, translation becomes interpretation all the way down. This applies to your own language too. When you think you understand a word, you're interpreting it based on other words, which you interpret based on still other words. Meaning becomes a web of circular definitions with no foundation in non-linguistic reality. Dictionaries define words in terms of other words, creating closed loops of meaning that never connect to anything outside language itself. The symbol grounding problem in artificial intelligence illustrates this challenge. How do symbols in a computer get their meaning? A chess program manipulates symbols representing kings, queens, and pawns, but the symbols don't mean anything to the computer. They're just patterns of electrical activity. The meaning exists only in the minds of human programmers and users. Similarly, the words in your head might be just patterns of neural activity without intrinsic meaning. What makes these patterns meaningful while other neural patterns remain meaningless? Your brain processes vast amounts of information unconsciously, but only some processing becomes meaningful, conscious thought. What distinguishes meaningful symbols from meaningless activity? Derrida's deconstruction shows how meaning depends on difference and deferral. Words get their meaning not from what they refer to, but from their differences from other words. Hot means what it means because it's not cold, not warm, not freezing. Meaning is always relational, never absolute, always depending on a network of other meanings. But this makes meaning fundamentally unstable. If hot depends on cold for its meaning, and cold depends on hot, then neither has independent meaning. The entire system of meaning floats free from any fixed foundation, like a house of cards built on air. Context determines meaning, but context itself has no fixed meaning. The hermeneutic circle in interpretation shows how understanding requires what it seeks to explain. To understand a text, you need to understand its parts. But to understand the parts, you need to understand the whole. You approach every text with pre-understandings that shape what you find, but you can only revise these pre-understandings based on what you find. Interpretation becomes circular, with no neutral starting point. This applies to understanding itself. To understand understanding, you need to understand what understanding is, but this requires the very capacity for understanding that you're trying to comprehend. You cannot step outside understanding to examine it objectively, because the examination itself requires understanding. Linguistic relativity suggests that language shapes thought in ways that make translation between very different languages impossible. If Eskimos really have dozens of words for snow, though linguists dispute this, they might perceive snow-related distinctions that English speakers cannot. Your language doesn't just describe your world, it constructs it, making some thoughts possible, while others remain unthinkable. The metaphorical nature of abstract language complicates things further. You understand time in terms of space, long meeting, short break, mind in terms of container, ideas in your head, an argument in terms of war, defending a position, attacking weak points. These metaphors aren't optional decorations. They're how abstract concepts become thinkable. But metaphors can mislead as well as illuminate. When you think of the mind as a computer, you notice certain aspects, information processing, while ignoring others, emotion, consciousness, creativity. The metaphors embedded in your language shape not just how you communicate, but how you think. Even logic becomes problematic when expressed in language. Logical words like and or an if seem precise, but natural language versions are surprisingly complex. If you're hungry, there's food in the fridge doesn't mean the same thing as material implication in formal logic. Ordinary language resists the precision that logical analysis requires. The performative dimension of language adds another layer of complexity. Words don't just describe, they do things. I promise. I apologize. I pronounce you married. These utterances don't report on events, they are events. The meaning of these statements depends not just on their content, but on the context, intentions, and social relationships involved. This suggests that communication is less about transmitting information and more about coordinating behavior. When you speak, you're not sending thoughts from your mind to mind, but engaging in a complex social interaction that creates meaning through the interaction itself. As your consciousness drifts towards sleep and language begins to fragment into dreamlike associations, consider this. Perhaps the miracle isn't that communication sometimes fails, but that it ever seems to succeed. Maybe understanding is always partial, always creative, always a leap of faith across the unbridgeable gap between minds. What are you trying to say when words themselves don't know what they mean? You've journeyed through 11 segments of philosophical paradoxes, each one dismantling another piece of the comfortable certainty with which you began. Now you arrive at the final paradox, the impossibility of reaching any final conclusions about the nature of reality, knowledge, or existence itself. Every attempt to end this exploration runs into the same problem. Conclusions require the very faculties that the paradoxes have called into question. To conclude that reality is uncertain, you must use uncertain reasoning. To determine that knowledge is limited, you must employ limited knowledge. To argue that conclusions are impossible, you must reach a conclusion about the impossibility of conclusions. This isn't just a clever logical trap, it reveals something fundamental about the human condition. You are a being who seeks understanding using tools that may be inadequate for the task. Your mind, evolved for survival in a specific environment, now grapples with questions that stretch far beyond its original purpose. It's like using a hammer to perform brain surgery. The tool and the task are mismatched from the start. Consider what you've encountered in this mental labyrinth. The Ship of Theseus suggests identity is an illusion, yet you maintain a sense of self. The simulation hypothesis implies reality might be computational, yet your experiences feel immediate and real. Free will appears to be determined, yet you continue making choices. Consciousness seems impossible to explain, yet here you are, undeniably conscious. Each paradox doesn't resolve, it deepens. The liar's paradox makes truth unstable. The bootstrap paradox makes causation circular. The observer effect makes objectivity impossible. Time becomes relative and possibly illusory. Language fails to communicate the very thoughts it claims to express. Yet here's the strangest thing. These paradoxes don't destroy your ability to function. You continue to live as if identity is real, time flows forward, free will exists, and communication is possible. The paradoxes reveal the gap between how reality appears to work and how it might actually work, or whether the distinction between appearance and reality makes any sense at all. This gap might be unbridgeable not because of intellectual limitations, but because consciousness itself is paradoxical. You are a pattern that recognizes patterns, a system trying to understand itself, a process attempting to step outside itself for objective analysis. The very capacity that makes you capable of discovering these paradoxes also makes you incapable of resolving them. The ancient Greeks had a word, aporia, meaning a state of puzzlement, an impasse in reasoning, where contradictory conclusions seem equally valid. They understood that some questions lead not to answers, but to deeper questions, not to solutions, but to the recognition that the problem is more complex than initially imagined. Perhaps wisdom lies not in resolving paradoxes, but in learning to live with them. Maybe the goal isn't to eliminate mystery, but to become comfortable with uncertainty. The paradoxes might be features, not bugs, essential aspects of any reality complex enough to contain beings capable of questioning their own existence. Consider that these paradoxes emerge precisely because you possess consciousness, language, reasoning, and self-awareness, the very capacities that make you human. A being without these abilities would never encounter these puzzles. The paradoxes are the price of sophistication, the inevitable result of minds complex enough to examine themselves. This suggests a recursive relationship between consciousness and paradox. Consciousness generates paradoxes by becoming self-referential, but paradoxes might also generate consciousness by forcing systems to become recursive, self-examining, and self-modifying. Perhaps consciousness and paradox co-create each other in an endless bootstrap loop. The meditation traditions of various cultures have long recognized that rational analysis has limits. They speak of transcending the thinking mind, of moving beyond conceptual understanding to direct experience. But even these traditions face paradoxes. How do you use the mind to transcend the mind? How do you think your way out of thinking? Zen koans are deliberately paradoxical, designed to exhaust rational analysis and point toward non-conceptual awareness. What is the sound of one hand clapping? What was your original face before your parents were born? These questions don't have logical answers. They're meant to break logical thinking and open up other ways of knowing. But perhaps the deepest paradox is that you cannot step outside the system of experience to evaluate experience objectively. You cannot think without thoughts, know without knowledge, or be conscious without consciousness. You are forever trapped inside the very thing you're trying to understand. Not trapped like a prisoner, but like a wave trying to understand water while being made of water. This creates what philosophers call the problem of the criterion. To know something, you need criteria for knowledge, but to establish valid criteria, you need to know what makes criteria valid. To think clearly, you need clear thinking about clear thinking. Every foundation rests on assumptions that cannot be independently verified without circular reasoning. As your mind prepares for sleep, notice how consciousness itself becomes paradoxical. The boundary between waking and dreaming blurs. Rational thought gives way to associative logic. The sense of self becomes fluid. You're about to spend hours in a state where impossible things seem normal, where causation breaks down, where identity shifts constantly. Dreams might be consciousness experimenting with paradox, testing reality's boundaries when the constraints of logic are relaxed. In dreams, you can be multiple people simultaneously, exist in multiple places, experience effects without causes. Perhaps dreaming is the mind's way of exploring possibilities that waking logic cannot accommodate. The final paradox is that there is no final paradox. Each ending suggests new beginnings. Each conclusion opens new questions. Each resolution creates new problems to solve. The journey through paradox is recursive. You end where you began, but at a higher level of the spiral, carrying new questions born from old answers. Maybe that's what makes consciousness extraordinary. Not that it solves the puzzle of existence, but that it keeps the puzzle alive. Without consciousness, there would be no questions about reality, no wonderment about existence, no search for meaning in an apparently meaningless universe. Consciousness creates the very problems it struggles to solve. You began this exploration seeking understanding and found uncertainty. You looked for answers and discovered better questions. You wanted to resolve paradoxes and learn to appreciate their unresolvable nature. This might be the most human thing of all. To seek what cannot be found, to question what cannot be answered, to explore what cannot be mapped. As sleep approaches and consciousness dissolves into unconsciousness, carrying these paradoxes with you into the realm where paradox is normal and logic is the exception, remember this: the fact that reality contains mysteries doesn't make it less real. The fact that consciousness is paradoxical doesn't make it less precious. The fact that existence is inexplicable doesn't make it less extraordinary. Perhaps the deepest truth is that there is no deepest truth, just an endless spiral of questions, questioning questions, mysteries, investigating mysteries, paradoxes, paradoxically explaining paradox. Sweet dreams, if dreams are what you think they are. And if they're not, well, that's just another paradox to explore tomorrow. The end that is not an end, because every ending is a beginning, and every beginning was always already an ending.